Hey guys, it's Alex, and it's finally time to follow up my worst video with my best video. This is sort of the pre-best video. Because I had so many books that I wanted to talk about, I decided to split them into my very best favorite books of the year and then my honorable mention best. And this is my honorable mention video. I have 9 books or authors on this list, and then I have 3 more that are absolute favorites to talk about tomorrow. And I just figured if I put them both together, it'd be a really long video. So I'm splitting them up just a little bit so that hopefully we don't wind up with another 25-minute monstrosity. These books are in no particular order. I gave them all 4 stars, and I did have issues with them to some degree, but I really did think that they were all incredibly worthwhile books that I would highly recommend. The first book I have to talk about is In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. This is a memoir of a woman who escaped North Korea, was sex trafficked in China, and then eventually wound up in South Korea, where she currently lives as a human rights activist. I gave this book 4 stars, but I really thought about giving it 5 stars. Like, it was literally so close to getting 5 stars for me because I thought it was absolutely amazing. But it was just, the book overall wasn't absolutely stunning and perfect enough for me. Like, I don't believe in perfection when it comes to books, but In Order to Live really didn't leave me feeling with that this was an absolute favorite feeling. It was a very beautiful story that was so well told, and just a really important book. I felt like I learned a lot from that book, and that she wrote it to inform people, and she did an absolutely wonderful job at that. And I feel like if you're at all interested in human rights issues or North Korea or the refugee experience at all, I would highly recommend this, because I do think that if you're interested in those topics and you don't read In Order to Live, you're very much missing out. Next, I have The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This I read back in August or September, I believe, and I thought this was so beautiful. This is an adult fantasy novel about 2 people who are apprentices to magicians who wind up in a sort of conflict trying to beat each other by showing off their own skill. It's not very plot driven at all. It's a very slow book, but it's so worth it for the atmosphere. This isn't the kind of thing I would normally pick up or really enjoy, but this book was beautifully written, and the whole setting of the circus was so well done. It's one of those books that just makes the setting come alive. Like, the circus was a character in and of itself, the way it changed, the way it moved. The circus was really the focal point of the story, and I think if you're going in for a fight between magicians, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But if you go in this just looking for the atmosphere and the writing and a beautiful storytelling technique, I think this is a book you'd enjoy, because I'm not really into the sort of magicians fighting aspect of it, and I did have some difficulties with the characterization, but I adored this book, and it's very, very hyped, but I think it deserves every bit of that. Definitely not for everyone, but if you are someone who can kind of put aside the story and the characters in favor of the storytelling and the atmosphere, this is so worth it. Next, I have The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. This is about a girl who was raped either right before her freshman year of high school or during her freshman year of high school by her brother's best friend, and then the book follows her over the course of her 4 years in high school as she sort of copes with the trauma and changes as a person. This is the book that I was most hesitant about putting on my list because I had such a strong emotional reaction to this in a very positive way. This was a book that really touched me, and I really related to it, and I felt that it was very important. And I had never read a book about a teenager who was raped and reacted in quite that way, because she was allowed to be a negative person. She was allowed to take that pain that she was feeling and cause other people pain. And I don't mean like as a person, but like as a character. She was allowed to react badly to the rape, as opposed to, in many cases, rape victims are supposed to be like the perfect victim, and that's how they're written in fiction. And I liked that she wasn't stuck in that narrative. But I felt like the story had a lot of issues. There was a lot of slut-shaming that was like very concerning and was very much an issue for me when reading the story. And I do think that like when this book is read, it needs to have a discussion surrounding it, particularly when the readers are a young adult audience, as this book is intended for. And just overall, I really didn't think this book was as well written as some of the others on this list. I felt like this was the perfect book that I wanted to read. I just wanted it to be more well done. But the emotional reaction I had to this book was so strong that I really do think it was worth putting on this list. And it really would have been a disservice to both the book and to myself not to have it here. Because I do think it's a worthwhile read, and I think it's an important read, but I also do think that there's a lot of negatives when it comes to this book that really do need to be discussed. The fourth book on this list is The Nazi Officer's Wife by Edith Hahn. This is another nonfiction book, a memoir about a Jewish woman during Germany in the 30s and 40s who wound up marrying a Nazi officer and escaping the Holocaust by hiding in plain sight. And I think it's a very interesting take on World War II. And not an interesting take, an interesting perspective would be a better word, because it's one that we really don't get very often. We get a lot of the Jews who literally hid inside buildings, like with Anne Frank, and we hear a lot from the Jews who went to the concentration camps, like Elie Wiesel. But I feel like this book sort of fills in a gap of the Jews who really did neither, but were still hiding in plain sight. They were called U-boats, and I've never really read anything about them before. And just overall, this book was so fascinating and so interesting, and I felt like this was one of my favorite books earlier in the year. This was probably the first nonfiction book I read this year that I really loved, and it was so interesting and worthwhile. And I think for anyone who is very interested by World War II or who likes reading about the Holocaust, I think this is a book that you really should pick up. I adored it. I want to buy myself a copy at some point because I read a library copy. It was just really so good. And I do have a thriller on this list to go with the big batch of thrillers that I put on my worst list, and that is The Book of You by Clair Kendal. This was a very interesting thriller that I thoroughly enjoyed. It's about a woman who's being stalked, and the book is told through journal entries, essentially, that she's writing to keep track of her stalker's movements, because she wants to turn him into the police. Like, she legitimately wants to go get help to get him to stop, but she doesn't think she has enough evidence. Like, she doesn't think anyone's going to take her seriously, because the way this book is written, and what I really loved about it, was that everything was so small and realistic. Like, obviously, big things like murders and rapes and large-scale assaults happen in real life. I would never say that they don't, but I do feel like one of my main issues with thrillers is that everything seems so melodramatic and so over the top, and that makes it feel less real. Whereas in this book, all the actions that her stalker took for, at least a good portion of the beginning of the book were very small, and that didn't make them less scary. In fact, to me, it made them more scary. Like, he would wait for her outside her house to walk her to work, and she didn't want him to do that, so she'd say that, or she'd avoid him, and if she started leaving earlier to miss him, he would show up earlier, and he'd wait for hours, and, that's one of those things that's, it's so creepy and scary when you're in that situation, but you also feel like you can't go to the cops. And that was what I loved about this book. It was just, the whole atmosphere of it was terrifying, and it really scared me. I just absolutely adored it. I do think it was a little bit let down by the ending. That was sort of why it got 4 stars from me instead of 5 stars. But if you're a fan of thrillers, and that sounds interesting to you, I would highly recommend it, because it was genuinely so enjoyable and scary and worthwhile. Definitely by far the best thriller I read this year. I also have an author on this list, like I did for my worst list, and that author is Lisa Gardner. This is her book Right Behind You, which I didn't feel that individually any of her books deserved to be on this list, but as a whole, I really enjoyed her. I discovered her either early in 2018 or very late in 2017, and I read most of her books this year, which is, I feel, fairly impressive because she's one of those thriller authors who puts out a book every year or two. She writes very generic cop crime thrillers, and I don't think the books are anything particularly special, but they're very enjoyable. They're very fun, they're very easy to read, and I just flew through them. They were perfect gym books for me, just so entertaining that I would forget that I was on the elliptical for an hour. But also easy enough that I wasn't falling behind or getting distracted and too tired. I really have enjoyed reading her. I've given her books a variety of ratings from 2 stars to 4 stars. I think this was a 4-star one. But just overall, if you like kind of generic cop thrillers, I think she's a good one. I wouldn't heavily push her on anyone. She's not amazing, branching outside the genre, but she's so much fun. And sometimes that's all you want, is just a little bit of fun. The last memoir on this list is Fast Girl, A Life Spent Running from Madness by Suzy Favor Hamilton. Suzy Favor Hamilton was an Olympic runner. She was very well known, I think, in the early 2000s or the late 90s. She was very hyped going into the Olympics. Like, she got a lot of press, she had a lot of brand deals, and she basically failed the Olympics, like, a couple times. Like, she did really horribly. Like, at one point in her last Olympics, she, like, fell in the middle of a race. And she cited exhaustion at the time, but she does talk about how, like, she literally gave up in the middle of the race. Like, she saw she was behind and she didn't want to lose, so she just dropped to the ground and pretended like it was exhaustion. And a lot of the book is about her bipolar disorder and how that's affected her life from childhood through her current life. And it deals with the sex scandal she was involved in, because it was discovered that she was working as an escort in Las Vegas, like a very high-priced escort. And it was a very interesting book and a very enlightening book, I think. I didn't exactly think it was the best written, but it was very informative and very interesting to read, and it came across as very honest. Like, she frequently didn't paint herself in the best light. She often painted herself in a very negative light, and she was sort of explaining her actions and, like, why she did the things she did and how her bipolar disorder affected her. But she wasn't just, like, using it as an excuse or, like, justifying herself. She was just explaining her reasoning. And I think if you're interested in learning about mental illness or athletes in general, I think this is a very good book to read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'd never really known much about Suzy Favor Hamilton apart from the SVU episode that was kind of inspired by her. But I did find this book very worthwhile, and I'm so glad that I wound up reading it. And then I come to my final real book on this list, although there's one more that I will talk about at the end. And that is Forgotten Country by Katherine Chung. This is an adult novel about a Korean family who immigrates to America. And it's mostly about the oldest daughter, but it also tells a story of, like, two sisters and the family as a whole and how they relate to each other. Her sister at one point kind of goes missing. Not so much missing as she takes herself off the grid and doesn't want to be found by her mother. I sort of picked this up looking for a thriller or, like, some kind of mystery book, and it really wasn't that at all, but it was so beautifully written, and it really captured the experience that this family went to immigrating to America and the problems they had, and sort of when they returned to Korea at certain points, what it was like for them. It talked a lot about Korean culture and the way they felt different in America and the way they had to change themselves, and it was just a beautiful story. It was very sad. I don't think it made me cry, but I was definitely close. Like, if you're interested in any kind of Asian literature, if you're interested in an immigrant story, or if you're just interested in a family story, this was really, really well done. And I've never heard anyone else talk about it, which doesn't necessarily mean it's not very popular. I just think it's a really worthwhile story, and it's worth it to read. I think a lot of people would really enjoy this. It is a very slow story, and it's more about the family as a unit than it is about, like, a specific plot. If you're looking at it as a woman tracking down her sister, that's not what it's about at all. I felt like the description kind of failed a little bit in some aspects, but it was a wonderful story. The final book is one I felt obligated to put on this list, and technically I gave it 5 stars. That is Dr. Coptr, the Flying Physician Who Kept His Promise to Tangier Island by Bill Lohmann. Bill Lohmann is my father. I edited this book, so as you can tell, my rating is clearly completely unbiased. I'm really mentioning this book out of obligation because I do feel like he wrote it, I edited it, it's my job to promote it, at least in some small degree. This is a non-fiction indie book about a doctor who wound up going to a small island off the coast of Virginia and providing them with a lot of medical care because they couldn't afford to have a doctor of their own. It was only a few hundred people who lived on the island. It's a really interesting book, and I mean, I'm completely biased saying this, but it is interesting. If you're from Virginia or really the DMV area, or you're interested in sort of like small town doctors, I do think this is an interesting read. It's really worth it. I think people who are interested in the Eastern Shore will probably get a lot more out of it than, like, someone who's, say, from Canada. Probably don't really care much about this book, but I'm obligated to mention it, and I do think it's a really good book. Just, it's my father. Like, I can't rate it less than 5 stars, and I can't not promote it. Let me know down below if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought of them if you had. I'd love to talk about some of my favorites because some of these I read really early in the year, so I haven't talked about them on my channel before. I will also link down below any reviews I have. I haven't reviewed all of these, sadly, but the ones I have, those reviews will be linked down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.